Today, we're going to be talking about something that has been on the minds of a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh players inside of the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG. Now, I know we normally cover Master Duel, but this is kind of important because it's somewhat of a topic that relates to both. Inside of the Yu-Gi-Oh TCG, there has been a plethora of discussion on Tier 0 formats. And specifically, we have this image right here. Format's actually unreasonable, make it stop. From Farfa YGO. I love Farfa, and I think this is a crazy, crazy photo. If you don't know, this photo is from the most recent YCS, and this is from Full Power, the Ishizu tier. Now, Ishizu tier is Ishizu Tearlament plus miscellaneous other cards. It is probably one of the craziest formats that we've had in a very long time. There's extensively long chain links, a lot of complicated board states, and things to clarify, and this screenshot exemplifies it all. I could not tell you what is happening inside of this picture just from showing it to you. Even with the context, knowing that this is at the highest level of play, this is incredible. This is truly, truly incredible. A lot of people have been referring to this photo and referring to this YCS as a Tier 0 format. If you don't know, a Tier 0 format is when the best deck in the format is the highest represented. It's not even close to the next few decks. If we take a look at, I believe it is this one, YCS Dabble, YCS Minneapolis, this is the exact one. It's 17 Tearlaments, 9 Sprite, 3 Fluanderies, 1 Dragon Link, 1 Exo Sister, and 1 Bestial Thunder Dragon. That's not a lot. 17 Tearlament. That's an incredible Tier 0 format. Now, to be fair, the Sprite cards could also be playing Tearlament. They could also be playing some other cards. Generally speaking here, Tearlament is like just the way to go. Best deck in the format is not only the highest represented, but it's also the best option to play. So now you're in a format where it's either you're playing the best option or not at all. That's Tier 0. What we kind of have to understand is that people are not happy with this format, but some people don't. Farfa goes on to say this format is very skill intensive and rewarding. True. Do you know what else is skill intensive and rewarding? Aerospace engineering. Doesn't mean I want to do that for fun or to relax. I think the average player doesn't enjoy one deck formats and such exhaustively long single turns. And it's hard to disagree. I think that Farfa makes a great point here, saying that the casual Yu-Gi-Oh audience, the casual player base, is not going to prefer something like this. Casual audiences really, really like to play super diverse formats. But I'd argue that should we even truly care about that? I'd actually argue no. And here's why. Asala here is a professional Yu-Gi-Oh player, commentator, and coach. You may have seen Asala on various live streams for the Konami tournaments. You might have seen him around for different teams. He's a top level player and has been competing at the top level for many, many years. Asala had this to say: people can hate on Tier 0 formats and overly powerful decks all they want, but when the game is at a point where a game like Jesse's top 4 game 3 can happen, I'm always for it. Absolutely beautiful gameplay. Professional players that were playing this YCS actually really like this format. You know, people were saying it's very skill intensive, very rewarding. Meaningful decisions are happening. Essentially inside of Yu-Gi-Oh, there's not a whole lot that goes on that makes you say, I think this is a meaningful decision point. And what I mean by meaningful decision point is that you can take a look at the scenario, the board state otherwise, and say to yourself, am I making the correct play? What is this going to gain me? What does my opponent have? You can think a couple moves ahead. But I feel like oftentimes in Yu-Gi-Oh, we don't really get that. We don't really get these meaningful decision points as much as we think we do, as much as we convince ourselves that we get those things. You know, ultimately inside of Yu-Gi-Oh the past couple of years, there have been formats and decisions that are really intricate, but ultimately there is a definitive best play. A lot of people disagree with the Asala. I think that Farfa is definitely one of them, but we also have Aurora YGO, who's another Yu-Gi-Oh tuber, tweeting out things like, very strange how people prefer a format like this for skill, as opposed to an incredibly diverse format because there aren't enough spots in the side deck. But if you're relying so heavily on those side matchups, does it really mean that you lack the skill without it? Because while I do think that there is a valid criticism in the fact that diverse formats don't have enough coverage and also that tier 0 formats you only can cover for 1, I think that I have to agree with MBT here. Every single rogue strategy or rogue option might have some unaccounted for BS that you're going to come across in tournaments. And that feels bad for top players. I see a lot of people make the argument that there isn't enough slots in the side deck to play and account for a diverse format, but that is kind of a big deal. And for the most part anyways, you know what players are going to do, what good top level players are going to do. They're going to say, what are the best decks? And what does my deck lose to? I'm just gonna side for those decks particularly. They're not gonna side for the other 20 or 30 decks that are good inside the format, considering that only the top decks. They're not gonna consider everything else, which is how that works in the first place. I mean, you take a look at this one also from Aurora YGO, saying that this format was in June, where did we go wrong? I argue that we did nothing wrong. If you take a look at this list, this thing has about 11 to 10 similar variants of the punk/adventure strategy. We have Lureless Tri-Brigade, Tenny Sword Soul, Adventure ABC, Marincess, Plunder Patrol, Despia Branded, Sky Striker, Flaunderies, and then Dragon Link, etc., etc. But this is no way to live. I'd argue that a format like this is ultimately worse for a lot of different people. While you might think to yourself, oh, I have so many decks I can choose from to play, this is awesome, I think a lot of other players, and especially at the top level of play, will tell you that this is very frustrating. There's so many factors and things to account for, so many things to play and prep against, so many different cards that I have to account for, not only inside of my own deck, but against anyone that I could come across in tournament. Because you know what? Any of these decks might have a losing matchup to some random rogue strategy. And that random rogue strategy, let's say you pair up with them, you're not gonna account for whatever BS they're gonna throw your way. And that's frustrating. That makes you think that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just super high variance. And that's the word, and that's the key word I wanna get across here, is that high variance is typically very bad for good competitive gameplay. You know, we continue with MBT, and MBT Yu-Gi-Oh! MBT Funnyman has this tweet, first and foremost. Rotisserie chicken. The second is Yu-Gi-Oh! Players, when the format is extremely skill intensive, games are engaging and have a ton of back and forth and interaction, and both players get to enjoy a cool, flashy match. You're getting these cool back and forth games specifically because players have accounted for factors that they can foresee coming. The variance that's within Yu-Gi-Oh! And within the format of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is enough to where it's controllable, where you can really sit down and master the format. You might say to yourself, well, Swolelax, that's actually really ridiculous. No one would ask for this and no one would play in that kind of format. That's actually not even true. Look at GOAT format. Look at Edison format. These aren't necessarily tier 0 formats by any means. I'd argue that GOAT format is technically the worst one because the best decks in the world are some variation of Chaos, Control, or Warrior Toolbox. But any type of format with 1 to 2, maybe 3 best decks is like right in the sweet spot, where you have enough variance to where it makes it interesting and cool, but not enough variance where it's frustrating to deal with, frustrating to account for, frustrating to play the game against. Most GOAT format plays and most GOAT decks consist of a similar power cards that you know that they're playing and that you can be like, okay, I know how my deck interacts with this type of card. And this type of interaction I can account for, I can practice against, and I can get better. But you can't get better at a diverse format. That doesn't happen because the variance is so high that you'd have to play millions of games to get game states, and that gets you the reps. It's all about getting reps in. Like, take a look at Edison. Edison's a weird case where I'd argue that Edison is actually the antithesis of what happens whenever you get a diverse format at first, but then give it time to marinate. Now, I know that Edison format is an incredibly diverse format historically. We have a ton of different decks and a ton of different engines that you can run inside your builds. But I'd argue that as time has gone on, the player base has kind of seen to themselves, okay, there are certain decks that are just strictly really, really good. These top decks for Edison, Blackwing, Lightsworn, Vayu Turbo, Diva Hero, Diva Zombie, and Hero Beat are the most popular decks. While yes, there are other decks you can play, and while yes, there are other engines you can play, these ones seem to be popping up everywhere inside of tournaments. So initially, on the perception of a very wide range of cards, you start to see that dwindle down into what would be considered to be these engines and these decks and these shells, right? Black Wings right now inside of Edison is probably one of the best decks in that format after years and months of people getting into it. And so what I'm trying to say here though is that even though the Edison is very high variance, the lower the variance got, I think the more that people were starting to understand how the format works, how their cards interact with different cards in that format, and then firmly decide what is good, what is bad. That's what happens. You take known factors at high variance, you shave them down until you have every single interaction that you could ever have, and then that's how you get and determine the best decks. That breeds good competition, by the way, because people master their decks and start to understand more about what's going on. But clearly as well, I think over GOAT format, why Edison is also getting to be more popular in GOAT format, is you have different points of interaction that are unique to the archetype and the decks that are popular. I'd like to compare Edison, if you will, to a specific game. And this is, unfortunately, where we have to introduce the melee argument into Yu-Gi-Oh! So, the melee argument into Yu-Gi-Oh!, at least in my opinion, is that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is most analogous, I think, to Super Smash Bros. In terms of a fighting game. If you think of every single format or every single game as a fighting game, a character with kits and an archetype with kits, bunch of different characters with a bunch of different things that they can do unique to their character. However, you also have mechanics that are universal across the board. You know, people for a long time said that GOAT format is the melee of Yu-Gi-Oh! It has a bunch of things that are universal across the board, and each of the different decks kind of do something different. I disagree. I think Edison format has a ton of different decks and a ton of different strategies, but however, have some commonalities and common mechanics and things between them, which makes it a lot better for skill. You have things that you can account for and things that you should account for and things that you can't account for. That's, to me, a mark of a good competitive experience. So even for melee here, this is Hungrybox's tier list. This is from Event Hubs. You can clearly see that there are about 11 top characters here from the B tier up that do well in competitive melee. Would you say that this is bad variance? No. I'd argue this is the good version of high variance. You can have good and high, or sorry, you can have good and bad high variance. You can have very diverse games and diverse formats as long as there are enough things that can be accounted for. And Melee, over the course of its 20-year lifespan, has been dissected back and forth. And while it is extremely, extremely diverse, ultimately speaking, the cream of a crop rise up. And those matchups in between the top ranks from the B tier to the double S tier are really interesting, are really intricate. You could throw in the D tiers, the E tiers, and the F tiers because they all have their own interactions with each other. But ultimately speaking, the mechanics that are shared between all of these characters and what makes them different allows for good high variance and good low variance. It's a good balance between the two. When we have super diverse formats, I actually attribute it to something more like Smash Ultimate. But the point, as I'm trying to say, is that if you look at this character sheet, there's just so much here. There's way too many variables to account for. And yes, you can, in theory, similar to Melee and similar to other forms of fighting games, master each of the characters and each of the variations and the stages and whatever you're gonna be on to find the top level and find the top characters. But there's just so much variation and so much jank within that variation. Some characters lose to others and some characters win against those characters, and so on and so on and so on. Some would argue that this is a good thing. Some argue that this is the way to go, super diverse. But I'd argue, no. I think for casual play, this is okay. I think for casual play, this makes a lot of sense to have a lot of different things you can do and a lot of different things that you can't account for. But I think at the top levels of play, you have extremely simplified formats. Again, it's a balancing act between high variance and low variance. You want enough high variance to make it interesting, but you want enough low variance where players can account for non-BS things inside of their competitive experience. And that's what I think, ultimately speaking, people are missing about this discussion. That at the top levels of competitive play, a good competitive experience does not consist of super high variance. It's clear that historically speaking, we tend to take those formats and make them into our historic formats. Take a la Edison and GOAT format. They have enough high variance to make it interesting and enough low variance to make it competitively viable. From what I see from this June list of this June YCS, I don't think this is competitively viable. There is way too much stuff on here in random BS that you can't account for. That is just horrendous. I don't know where that leads us. While personally, I would love to have a super diverse format because I'm a budget player, I also love to see cool and interesting decks win that aren't just the best decks of the format, right? But I also want a good competitive experience. I really do. I want a good competitive experience for Yu-Gi-Oh! It's an interesting discussion that I think needs to be mulled over. I think people are ultimately forgetting the fact that at its core, if we want a good battle card game, the competitive experience probably needs to be prioritized. I don't know. Maybe that's just me though. I don't know.